put it mildly, the Percoco trial has been a wild ride. Star prosecution witness Todd Howe, he got arrested and hauled off to jail in the middle of the trial. And of course, there has been a lot to talk about, completing with Aide, of course, and of course, The Sopranos. Now, the jury, they've got to decide whether or not Percoco broke the law or whether it was just business as usual in Albany, an indictment of itself. As we know, the definition of corruption itself has evolved since the Supreme Court ruling involving the former Virginia governor upended everything. Well, let's bring in former federal prosecutor and good friend to the program, Roland Riopelle. And Roland, Dominic was saying it down lower Manhattan. Since McDonald, we have been in no man's land, and I have had no less than, I swear, 30 attorneys trying to find what corruption is and isn't post-McDonald versus quid pro quo and all the other moving definitions. Do you think we're any closer to clarity or not?
You know, Richard, this is the kind of thing that'll be sorted out in a number of cases as we move forward. This case presents a particularly difficult issue for the prosecution in some respects because some of the payments were made and the actions were done by Mr. Percoco when he was not in state government. And those are actions that the government really can't prosecute. And the Judge Caproni, who, of course, is very familiar with this issue because she had the Silver trial, she's already thrown out at least one of the counts against Mr. Percoco on that basis.
You know, it would seem from the outside that this is somewhat slam dunk. I know Todd Howe, an extremely flawed witness here, but between the ZD, the low-show job for Mrs. Percoco, the use of the office of the governor to basically, as an imprimatur, you know, help get state contracts in the hands and the pockets and the influence used as a consequence thereof, it certainly seems like an abuse of power, but you don't think that's as clear black and white with the law?
No, and you know, the way the criminal law works, Richard, and this is as it should be, if you're violating the criminal law, it should be clear to you. There's a speed limit. It's 55. You know, if you're doing 56, you're breaking the limit. If there isn't a clear line, the law provides, with what's called the rule of lenity and all the rest of it, that, you know, you don't get prosecuted. There was activity here that you might think is reprehensible, but unless it's a clear violation of a statute, it may not be a crime. And that is essentially what Mr. Percoco is arguing. Now, the prosecution has got, admittedly, plenty of smelly stuff to throw at the jury here, and in many cases that'll carry you over the finish line, and it may do so in this case.
Roland, I'm curious, with the benefit of hindsight, as in a former federal prosecutor, I'm sure you've had to use witnesses that you knew were flawed, to put it politely. Do you think they should have put Howe on the stand?
I think they had to. I think they had to, and obviously they did that, not knowing his most recent peccadillo. And to their credit, Richard, they threw him in jail and did the right thing. I've seen many a case where the government's witnesses do things like this and nothing happens at all. So to the government's credit, they really took action in this case, which doesn't happen most of the time.
Do you think there should be a distinction between the actions of a lobbyist and an elected official? We're going to be looking at retrials shortly, as Dominic mentioned, with Shelley Silver. And I've had to cover, you know, the same thing with Skelos, with Menendez, and now, obviously, while not elected officials, certainly somebody tied to it. Is there a distinction with a difference? Should we, the public, have a right to have as a standard for somebody who's representing the public? Does it have to be the spirit in the letter? And for that, I mean, nobody thought that Shelley Silver should have been able to basically use a taxpayer-funded thing to somehow direct money to his own law firm. Nobody thinks that Mangano should have been able, you know, to try and strong-arm people to let his numbskull son have a job, and then he try and shake down people. I can go down the line here, but abuse of power certainly seems clear enough.
Yeah, Richard, you put your finger on a very important point, but it is equally important that the law be clear and that a violation be clear. And this is a matter for our legislature. And yes, you and other citizens, all of us, should raise a hue and a cry about this problem and say that you got to write laws that make it crystal clear that what Shelley Silver was doing was bad. You got to write laws that make it crystal clear that Mr. Percoco ought to go to jail. But if that law doesn't exist, then these people get a trial, there's a horse race, and they may get a dismissal in the Court of Appeals when all is said and done,
but can't we show
even if the
stream of
jury
benefits?
does convict him.
But can't we show stream of benefits? I'd even argue I can show quid pro quo.
Sure, you know, you can show all that, but if the law says that you can't do a quid pro quo transaction with a state actor and the person is not a state actor, there's been no crime. So you got to write a new law. You got to make what the lobbyist is doing criminal. I agree, it stinks to high heaven. I don't like it. Write a law against it, but you can't prosecute the lobbyist as we now stand.
Well, I think at the end of the day, post-McDonald, the Supreme Court's going to have to re-examine this thing and get some, I don't trust the state legislatures, frankly, to police themselves. So,
well, and you know what, Richard? You make a good point there. That's why people ought to be up in arms about things like Citizens United, which is what creates this swamp.
You got it. Hey, Roland, I appreciate you dealing with the elements tonight here. Thanks so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure, Richard. Anytime.
All right, everybody. When we come back, I mentioned it off the top here, but President Trump, he made what appears to be yet another spur-of-the-moment decision, and this time it involves tariffs, and it could cause a trade war on a global level here. It also could cause another top official to give his notice to the White House.